Welcome to the Society for Economic Anthropology's Mergers and Acquisitions podcast. Each quarter, the podcast explores a particular topic that illustrates some of the ways anthropologists contribute to the study of economic life. Previous quarters have focused on climate finance, waste, entrepreneurship, and work and unemployment. These podcasts can be accessed by visiting the Society for Economic Anthropology's webpage. My name is Jenny Huberman, and this quarter, I'm speaking with some wonderful guests about capitalism in the digital age. Some of the questions we will be exploring include: how are digital technologies enhancing as well as disrupting processes of capital accumulation? How are they changing the way labor is experienced and exploited? Where should anthropologists be turning their attention, and what kinds of questions should they be asking in their efforts to understand how digital capitalism is produced, lived, and even resisted by those people who are differentially positioned within its ambit? Today, my guest is Jathan Sadowski. Jathan is a research fellow in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University, and his work focuses on the politics of technology and how digital systems and technologies are impacting social life. He is the author of many, many articles, as well as the book Too Smart: How Digital Capitalism is Extracting Data, Controlling Our Lives, and Taking Over the World. The book was published by MIT Press in 2020. Jathan, I am so delighted to have you here as my first guest on this podcast series devoted to capitalism in the digital age. And even though technically you are not an anthropologist, I do want to extend you an honorary membership to the club. I want to begin by thanking you for writing such a timely and important and well-written book. If there's anyone out there who's teaching a course on technology and society and is looking for a gem book to assign, I think that would be your book. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jenny. I really appreciate your kind words, appreciate the invitation. And yes, I'm not an anthropologist by training, but the Emerging Tech Lab where I'm based is directed by an anthropologist, Sarah Pink, and I'm surrounded by anthropologists every single day. So I think I have the honorary membership. For sure. So Jathan, I wanted to start by asking you, why did you write this book? That's a great question. So I finished my PhD in 2016 looking at the politics and visions of smart urbanism. So, a lot of times when people know that, they ask, is this my PhD book? But really, this is the book that's bringing together all the stuff I was thinking about and working on when not doing my PhD. Because the PhD is so narrowly focused on one specific area, smart urbanism. But as I was researching that, the ways in which smart technologies and smart systems and discourses around this were cropping up everywhere I was looking. And so I was chasing all these rabbits down all these different holes. And so I thought the book itself would be a really nice way to provide a much broader, more expansive viewpoint of a lot of these kind of logics and systems and technologies that I was coming across while more narrowly working on smart urbanism for my PhD.
And so one of the broader umbrellas and this is reflected in the title of your book, is the umbrella of digital capitalism. So I wanted to ask you, for clarification's sake, what do you mean when you invoke the term digital capitalism, and what do you see as some of its defining features, or as you talk about them, the imperatives of digital capitalism?
Yeah, I really did want to write a book about capitalism. I wanted to be in that kind of that literature and that long tradition of understanding how capitalism operates today and how it connects to previous iterations and modes of capitalism. So for me, digital capitalism is just that. It's a continuation of a lot of the different regimes and logics and structures for hundreds of years now that have been ongoing in society, really shaping how society looks like and how we live in society. And I, just kind of threw that adjective or descriptor of digital on there to really kind of mark that this is capitalism, but it's also capitalism being done with new technologies and perhaps for new purposes in some ways. These new technologies of looking at, data, for example, as becoming a really crucial form of capital within capitalism, something that companies and governments and or other organizations are very keen on accumulating, much in the same way that they accumulate other forms of capital. Looking at the ways in which digital technologies, these smart technologies of, with network connections and automation, are expanding new forms of control. This is the other kind of imperative I look at. So one is this imperative of collection, this accumulation of data capital. Then the other imperative is this imperative of control. And control and power has always been something capitalism and capitalists have been interested in maintaining and expanding. And I just see the ways in which new technologies allow for that control to operate in different ways and in a lot of ways more invasive and expansive than was previously possible with more industrial technologies of the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the things I really appreciate about your work, is because other scholars have suggested that digital capitalism marks a fundamental turning point in the evolution of capitalism. And you make the point in your book that actually it's adapting to the digital age, but it's still carrying out the same fundamental processes of extraction and exploitation. And at the same time, I think this question that you're raising about what is the technological difference? How does the technology perhaps change the nature of capitalist domination and capitalist control is also a really important question for us to be thinking about now. So you're talking about how, there's this new emphasis on collecting data and how data has become itself a form of capital. And also that these technologies enable the captains of the digital age to insert themselves into our life in ever intimate ways. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about the difference that the technology makes in changing the nature of capitalist domination?
Yeah, absolutely. I half jokingly say sometimes that a lot of, some of my most cited or most influential work is really just me applying different volumes of capital to contemporary technologies. So I'm like, what if Marx was writing about data when he was writing Capital Volume 1? And that's how I kind of came up with this analysis of data as a form of capital. And then I thought, how do we understand digital platforms? Are they this new disruptive technology, unlike anything that ever came before? When I started really picking apart how their business model actually works in terms of being these intermediaries, these gatekeepers controlling access to goods and services, inserting themselves in between different transactions and relationships and economic interactions, thought, well, that's how a landlord operates, right? That's how a rentier operates. And so I constructed this analysis of what I call the Internet of Landlords, kind of riffing on the Internet of Things, that digital platforms, in my opinion, are best understood through a lens of, Capital Volume 3, or even going back to Adam Smith or David Ricardo, right? Understanding them as this updated form of rentier capitalism. And for me, the ways in which these new technologies allow these, old structures and old systems of capital to operate differently is, it now, instead of just having to deal with a landlord who owns the house that you might live in, or or a bank that owns the car that you might lease. Now this kind of rentier relationship is expanded to anything and everything that has software embedded in it, right? The fundamental relationship that we have to software is not one of ownership, but one of licensing the software, which is another way of saying we rent access to that software. And that software can be revoked at any time because we don't own it. And so, when your toothbrush, for example, is a smart toothbrush and it has software in it, right? You could, that software license could be revoked and all of a sudden your toothbrush stops working. But we see this happening all over the place, not just with toothbrushes and toasters, but, there are a lot of big legal cases in the courts in the U.S. very recently, and the Federal Trade Commission made a rule around the right to repair. And the right to repair was essentially that manufacturers of automobiles and farm equipment like John Deere and General Motors said that when a farmer buys a multi-million-dollar tractor, they own the hunk of metal and rubber, but they only license the software. And so they don't actually own the ability to modify or repair that tractor. And it's really quite literally stripping farmers of the means of production, right? The means of food production. They don't own the capital equipment necessary. And so this is really quite interesting and also quite important in terms of the implications for what that means when all of a sudden we don't own things that we think that we own, but also our lives become a way of mining valuable data and information through all of our interactions with these things we don't own.
I've had a number of times, it's made me absolutely crazy, where I've tried to open up a document on my computer and I've gotten this sign that said, oh, you have to update your license in order, and I've been literally locked out of files that I could previously access, and it's made me absolutely crazy. I think also another point, I mean, this whole issue that you're raising about the platform economy and rentiership and all of this is interesting, but I think it's also, I just wrote a paper called Moments Are Still the Elements of Profit, and it was about the smartphone gaming app industry and these task apps. And as I began to dig into that industry more, one of the things that I came to realize is that there still is a kind of a theft of labor power that's being conducted through these platforms. That I think if Marx were looking at digital capitalism today, he would also be saying, oh, well, let's not forget, even though data has become central to processes of capital accumulation, even in the era of digital capitalism, there are many ways in which labor power continues to be the source of surplus value. So absolutely.
Yeah. No, I would 100% agree with that labor is always central. And yeah, I think a really big part of a lot of these technologies is hiding the labor and hiding the human workers that do actually make these things work. I think about things like artificial intelligence, and I've called this in my work Potemkin AI, where a lot of AI systems are more of a technological Potemkin village that hide the fact that a lot of times they're not actually AI. They're remote people making remote decisions. And in the cases where these companies are training artificially intelligent systems, they still rely on a massive amount of micro work to label data, to process it, to clean it, to make it machine readable, but then they claim all of the benefits and adulations of innovation, right? And erase the fact that there are a lot of human workers and labor that is still central to actually producing the surplus value that these machines, this, as Marx would call them, dead labor, then take the credit for.
Well, I'm going to be speaking with Mary L. Gray later in the podcast series, who wrote Ghost Work, Silicon Valley from creating a global underclass. And she was studying the people who are in the loop, who provide the training data for AI. And this is very much what she's been writing and thinking about. Another thing that I really like about your book is that you come out and you say this is really a book about technopolitics. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that. You say that the problems of smart tech are first and foremost problems of political economy and politics, and so too must be their solutions. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was really the impetus of the book, was not to so much write a book about technology, but to write a book about politics and political economy that took technology as its subject area, as its focus. Because for me, I'm very much building on and in the tradition of thinkers like Langdon Winner, who's a political theorist and wrote, really crucial work in the 70s and 80s in particular, advancing this theory of technological politics, that it's not that, we politicize technology, but that technology is always already a political phenomenon, because at its base, it's about materializing the interest and values of certain people over other people. It's about making trade-offs between certain, prioritizing some purposes and goals over other purposes and goals. And it's about including certain people in these decisions about what technologies are made and excluding others, right? And that's really the basis of politics, is that there's a conflict of interest, or there's a consensus that must be reached, or something, there's values at hand. And so for me, that's how I try to understand technology, as, really the product of people making certain choices, people materializing their interest in certain ways, and then putting that forward into the world. And so, that I think is, that kind of materialist understanding of technology, I think it makes a lot of sense when you lay it out, but I also think it's a kind of counterintuitive way of understanding technology, because it's not the way we're taught to see these things, where they kind of fall into our laps. For a lot of people, technology is something that happens to them. It's not something that happens by them or with them. It's something that it appears when the Apple Store lights up with a new product. That's technology, right? And so it really causes us to have this lack of understanding of all of the different processes and people and politics that went into that thing being there in that particular way at that particular time and space.
So what you're calling for is maybe more of a collective process in terms of deciding how technology should be used in society, a more explicit conversation about whose interests are being served by the smartification of society. You have a wonderful phrase in your book about embracing the virtues of dumbness, I think the phrase. What do you mean by that?
So this is coming towards the end of the book, when, after laying out, I think in your really, really good review essay, I must say, where you brought together my book with all these other books with people that you'll be talking to in this series, and provided such novel insights through this kind of synthetic analysis. I liked in the in your review, you mentioned how, despite the incredibly trenchant nature of the critique, I didn't leave you paralyzed in despair. And that, that's always a tendency I have to fight against in my work, is the kind of like, all right, I don't want us to be paralyzed. I want us to despair, but I want us to not give up. I want to rally us to do something about it. And so the last chapter of the book is really trying to lay out these, what I kind of, in a kind of tongue-in-cheek manner call, tactics for a dumber world, and thinking about these virtues of dumbness. And that really is me arguing for a counter paradigm to smartness. I talk about how the way in which, smart has become this big paradigm, this expansive movement in terms of what technology and therefore what society should look like, is so expansive that I think we need to react against it. We need to, not just revive the virtues of dumbness in terms of like, let's all have flip phones instead of smartphones. I'm not against people doing that, but it's more so again, taking that more political and economic viewpoint of the technology and saying, who is really making this? Is it us? Is it for us? And I think in a lot of cases, the answer is no. I mean, at the very least, we're sold these things, right? And we're sold these things based on ideological promises. And here I'm thinking of your own work, Jenny, on the ideology of convenience, looking at Amazon Go as a case study of this. But I think that does a lot of work to kind of say to us, you don't really have a choice in this, but if you go along with it, then you'll get a little bit something in return. It's what Lewis Mumford called the megatechnic bribe. He identified this 100 years ago, that there's a bit of a bribery going on here, that as long as we accept these technologies and the consequences they bring to society, then not all of us, but a huge majority of us, or a huge swath of us, will get some benefits from it. Some, perhaps they're marginal, but benefits nonetheless. And I think, for me, we should really demand more of technology. We should demand more of this thing that is, as Langdon Winter calls it, a form of legislation in our lives. Much in the same way that we, in a democratic society, demand that we have a say in holding decision makers to account and ensuring that our voices and values are represented in those decisions. We should do the same thing about technology. And this is what I advocate for in terms of calling for a democratization of innovation, saying that innovation should not be a process that's left in the big hands of a few people, venture capitalists, corporate CEOs, these people that have the wealth and influence to make investment decisions about what counts as good technology and what doesn't. Instead, this needs to be a public affair.
Do you know if any of those people have read your book? Have you heard from them?
I don't know if any of them have read my book. I haven't received any blistering hate mail from venture capitalists or CEOs yet. At least not about my book. In other regards, yes, but not about my book.
Well, you have a podcast as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I co-host a podcast called This Machine Kills with Edward Ongweso Jr., who's a labor and technology reporter at Vice Motherboard, and produced by Jeremy Brown.
All right. Well, I hope that the listeners of this podcast will check it out. I listened to a couple of episodes, and it was first of all, very entertaining and intellectually stimulating.
Thank you.
There was a specific question I wanted to ask you. Obviously your book is not a celebration of the emancipatory potentials of technology, but you also say in your book that while accounts of creepy new surveillance technologies tend to call forth associations with people like George Orwell or Aldous Huxley, you write, these foreboding prophets of the information age are not quite the right choices. And you go on and you say, these authors didn't anticipate how frankly haphazard and weird the smart society can be. They predicted a kind of surveillance and domination that operates like a super efficient, hyper-rational machine. In reality, what we get is something far more real, shitty, glitchy, gritty, venal, and violent. And I was really intrigued by this statement. And I would like to hear a little bit more about what you had in mind. And maybe if you can provide some examples of the weird, glitchy, gritty nature of digital capitalism.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That those are the tropes that we often see, is that, we live in 1984, we live in Brave New World. But for me, I then go on to say that I think instead, rather we should look towards other thinkers in the space of science fiction, not as prophets, but as artists who kind of captured a vibe, right? Captured a kind of sense or feeling of what this world looks like and its consequences. And I point to people like the film director Paul Verhoeven, who directed RoboCop and Starship Troopers, some classics, as well as the work of Philip K. Dick, who we're very familiar with his work through the movies that have been made from his books, but Minority Report, Do Anne George Dream of Electric Sheep? These kinds of works capture, for Verhoeven, it's a kind of techno-fascism, and for Philip K. Dick, it's a kind of techno paranoia. And I like this because the world that we live in, contrary to the kind of marketing brochures about, smart cities or the kind of pitch decks for venture capitalists is not this like, super shiny, new, hyper rational, works perfectly all the time world. I just think of the very recently, as of our recording earlier this week, so in mid-December, AWS, Amazon Web Services, crashed. And with that, a lot of things went down because AWS is the crucial infrastructure for cloud computing that much of not only websites, but also increasingly all these smart things that we have rely on AWS in order to operate. So it's a weird world where one company can have an outage and all of a sudden your toaster doesn't work anymore or your coffee machine doesn't work anymore because it relied on an internet connection, which itself relied on cloud computing from AWS. Like, we see all of these ways in which the world has become so deeply interconnected, so deeply suffused with these control systems that, like, I'm thinking of Deleuze, right? Deleuze's analysis on the postscript of societies of control, where it's about all of these kind of subterranean, interconnected, networked control systems that we don't really see. We don't really notice as long as they keep working. Here, thinking as well about like Susan Lee Starr's work on the ethnography of infrastructure, right? Infrastructure is something that we don't notice until it stops working. When AWS stops working, all of a sudden we see how fragile this system is, how one outage can cause all these different things to go down, and how that can have really severe consequences beyond the inconvenience of not being able to make your coffee, but also stories about, like, there's a lot of smart locks on apartment buildings or houses that also rely on internet connections. AWS goes down, suddenly you're locked out of your house. You can't get in without breaking through the door, breaking a window. And I think for me that really demonstrates that no matter how much these systems are designed to be perfect, and no matter how much they are promised to be these seamless, frictionless, totally integrated things, they'll never be that. There will always be errors, and there will always be glitches, and there will always be just humans in the mix. And I think the question for me is understanding, one, what that means for a system where we could be bricked at any moment, right? Where your thing can stop working because the internet connection was disrupted, but also how that then impacts us in both ways really mundane, but also ways really profound, how we can be caught in the glitches of a system that is espouses to be objective and totally correct at all times. But what happens if it makes a mistake? It's not going to accept that. It's going to deny that it ever made a mistake in the first place.
I was just teaching this week Catherine Besterman and Hugh Gusterson's edited volume. I think it's called Algorithms for Life, How Robo Processes Are Taking Over the World. It's not the exact title, so forgive me. And they are, they write a lot about this, and they write about how, these algorithmic, programs that are supposed to make our lives more seamless and smooth, in many cases end up creating all kinds of unanticipated complications and generating frustration and rage. And I've been thinking more and more about how we might actually think about the cultural consequences of the era of digital capitalism. And if, people like Frederick Jameson were arguing that postmodernism was the cultural logic of late capitalism, what is the moment we are living in today? And I was thinking more about how there is a certain sense in which I think we've moved out of this kind of playful pastiche, the new, the ephemeral, into a moment where people are more and more, haunted by the possibility that the internet doesn't forget, that they're being surveyed, that there is kind of almost a paranoia at times in the air, and just thinking about what kind of cultural ethos are all of these changes leading to. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, there are so many, great authors and thinkers that have, in very prescient ways, been working on this subject. So, in particular, I'm thinking of, for my podcast, we're doing this this book series where we're going chapter by chapter through Wendy H.K. Chun's book, Control and Freedom, Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics, which came out in 2005, really at the height of this like post 9/11 paranoid society and culture, and as well, really the very beginnings of the internet and Web 2.0, the kind of social web, and how paranoia was at that time a kind of overriding cultural affect in a lot of ways. Paranoia about who are you talking to online? What are my kids accessing online? Who is watching me when I'm online? All these different things. And I don't think that's gone away. I think it's just kind of changed. And in ways we've had to live with this paranoia. We've had to just make it a normal part of our lives that, okay, I'm probably being watched, and my boss is probably reading my email, and some, app that I use is probably tracking my locations at all time. And for me, I do wonder and think as well, we can see this in the kind of discourses that were really prevalent a few years ago around the death of privacy, and around how the new generations. I'm a millennial. Millennials, we killed privacy, right? Because we just stopped caring about it. But in reality, when you actually talk to people, when you do social scientific research on people's thoughts and feelings about things like privacy, data sharing, and data collection, what you end up seeing is more of a kind of apathy as a self-defense mechanism, right? It's this overriding sense that there are unknown people collecting unknown data for unknown purposes, and I can do nothing about it, right? And so what looks like a kind of a lack of caring or a death of privacy is in reality just a kind of a way of saying, if I were to concern myself about this, I would drive myself crazy, right. Because and so apathy is really the best thing I can do, and I think that is itself, we can see that kind of apathy as a kind of cultural affect, the consequences of that throughout a lot of different spaces in our lives and in society. And I think that, a lot of that has been both produced by, but also taken advantage by, the kind of technological logics and the ways in which technologies are created and used, again, in many cases on us, not necessarily with us or for us.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of the idea of apathy as a form of self-defense, because in my most recent writings and thinkings about this, I've been sort of playing with the idea that, this is all giving rise to a profound sense of anxiety. When I talk to my students, they're all talking very openly about the anxiety medication they're on and how the future is doomed, and they have to unplug their Alexas, although when they talk about sensitive things. But I think that you're onto something with this idea of the way in which apathy has become a cultural affect of digital capitalism. I hadn't really thought about that before. I think it's super interesting. A final question for you. What advice would you give to anthropologists who are studying capitalism in the digital age? Where do you think we need to be turning our attention? Where do you think we need to be doing field work and ethnography? What kinds of questions do you think we need to be asking about capitalism in the digital age? What kinds of spaces do we need to be gaining access to?
That's a really great question. And I'll answer this in part by talking about what my next project is, which I think is in many ways a very anthropological and it's an ethnographic project. So in a lot of ways, I'm more so leaning into the honorary membership of anthropology and saying, what role, where does this kind of ethnography need to be happening? What role does a kind of anthropological sensibility at the very least have for understanding digital capitalism? And I think for me, there's two avenues to this, and they very much build on things, much as digital capitalism is not this paradigmatic break from previous, forms of capitalism. I think the study of it also does not mean doing a paradigmatic break, right? It means learning from the tools and theories from before and applying them in different ways to different places. So on one hand, I'm beginning in 2022. So next year, I'm starting a 3-year project looking at the political economy of the insurance technology sector, or insurtech. And so as part of that, I'm really trying to understand the development and uses, the development, applications, and kind of implications of these new technologies, of the ways in which insurance companies are trying to use the tools of digital surveillance and digital capitalism to do insurance, to monitor us, to track us, to do personalized dynamic premium pricing and risk assessment and these kinds of things. And a big part of that, of understanding the emergence of this new sector, the insurtech sector, is that I'll be spending a lot of time doing ethnography at trade shows and industry conferences and social networking events within the industry. And, so really trying to understand the formation of this sector by seeing how do people within it talk to each other? How are they pitching themselves to each other? What kind of plans do they have for how this sector will develop? And just kind of, doing interviews, but also just doing these observations. And for me, this is very much within the line of a previous era of these kind of ethnographic work. I'm thinking of like Karen Ho's work, Liquidated, which is this kind of this ethnography of Wall Street. And so, but it's not necessarily Wall Street where the new masters of the universe are taking place, right? It's more like the offices of venture capitalists. It's the campuses of technology companies. It's these trade shows that bring together the financial sector and the technological sector. It's these kind of boundary zones or interstitial areas where these different sectors are meeting with each other and saying, hey, how can we collaborate? What new thing can we build together? So for me, those are the spaces that I'm looking to get into, and also would love other anthropologists and ethnographers to really focus their efforts on.
I just did a AAA panel, and Karen Ho was our discussant, and we were talking about some of these things. And I was telling her that one of my dreams, and I tried unsuccessfully, was to gain access to Singularity University. But they never responded to my application, and it's incredibly expensive to do one of their seminars. So that I haven't been successful in scaling the walls of Singularity. I think you're absolutely right that those are some of the kinds of spaces. And also, raises some questions that anthropologists have been grappling with for a long time about how do you study up? How do you get access to leads? I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff going on with venture philanthropy in Silicon Valley that would be totally fascinating to look at. So, but the insurance project sounds great. Is there a title for this project? Let's just call it a book because it will be one. Is there a title?
Yes. So it is. It's the title of the project, and it is funded through a grant from the Australian Research Council, and it's called Everyday InsurTech. And that's because I'm looking at what I call these everyday InsurTech, namely health, automotive, and property insurance. So really focusing my efforts on these forms of insurance that most people either have or actively need and kind of interact with on a more day-to-day basis versus the once in a lifetime things like life insurance or catastrophic risk insurance, these kinds of things. So and also kind of playing on some of the anthropological work on technology around like everyday practices, everyday technologies, and seeing how, I think for me, a kind of early hypothesis of looking at this sector and its technologies is that a big part of it is about multiplying the interaction points between insurance companies and their customers, where it's not just that you interact with your insurer when you have a car crash or something like that, but rather it becomes this constant and ongoing interaction as the insurer is kind of checking up on you, perhaps providing you with some behavioral nudges or incentives, so it really becomes about multiplying these points of an everyday relationship with your insurer.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds great. It sounds like it's going to be really fascinating, and I can't wait to read it. And I want to just give one more plug for your book, Too Smart. It's a wonderful book. And thank you, Jathan, and good luck with your future endeavors.
Thank you so much, Jenny. This was a great discussion. I really appreciate your invitation and engagement with my work.